Over the course of its 9 seasons, The Flash has aired 184 episodes. Some of them are incredible, some of them are good, and some of them are just decent, but especially in the later seasons, a lot of them are bad. In this video, I'll be ranking what I consider to be the worst of the worst, the 10 worst ever episodes of The Flash, and while the later seasons did have the occasional fluke that made it into the top 10 or the honorable mentions of the top 10, the opposite will not be true for this video. There are 0 episodes from the first 5 seasons that will be in the top 10 list, and just 1 episode in the honorable mentions. Eric Wallace simply raised the bar for the low quality that the show can reach, and even the worst episode of the first 5 seasons will only be an honorable mention. Speaking of, I listed off 15 honorable mentions for the top 10 best videos, so I'll be doing the same here. Going in release order, the 15 dishonorable mentions are Girls' Night Out, Success is Assured, Mother, the one with the 90s, Growing Pains, Timeless, Family Matters Part 1, Enemy at the Gates, Heart of the Matter Part 1, Keep It Dark, Negative Part 2, The Mask of the Red Death Part 1, The Mask of the Red Death Part 2, A New World Part 2, The Blues, and very unfortunately and very sadly, A New World Part 4 finale, which also means that one of the most controversial episodes of the first 5 seasons, Run Iris Run, in my opinion, doesn't even make it into the top 25 worst episodes of the show anymore. With all of that out of the way, make sure to subscribe and like this video, and let's begin with number 10. The first of many interlude episodes on this list, which are these dedicated blocks of the season dedicated completely to filler, and one of the worst of them is Masquerade, an episode from season 7 that focuses entirely on Cecile, while Cecile further develops her abilities, which not only makes this episode filler, but one of the worst, or the single worst kind of filler that entirely focuses on Cecile Horton, the worst character on this show. Sue Dearborn has a relatively large role in the episode as well, and while she is a little bit more entertaining than Cecile, ever since Ralph left or was kicked out, it's felt mostly pointless to have this character on the show, especially since she can be a bit goofy. Adding in season 7's signature awful writing and general goofiness, and you have one of the worst episodes in the show's history, but not nearly the worst episode of season 7. Not only is the Forces storyline absolutely terrible, because Barry and Iris being treated as their parents is super weird, and the personification of the Forces has always been dumb, but also in this episode in particular, Forces' CGI is god-awful and contributes to some awful-looking and very easy to make fun of shots and fight scenes. It's very difficult to watch. Additionally, this episode also treats Abracadabra so poorly. The way he's treated is so lame. Why does every villain have to be redeemed this season? Abracadabra is one of the last villains I would have thought is appropriate to redeem. This is also the episode where they separated Caitlin and Frost, which looking back was probably the final straw where this character was completely ruined, or these characters rather. The season 7 writing really doesn't help either, as this episode basically fails on practically every front. The only redeeming quality is in some of the visuals, as the cinematography and the colors and Flash's suit, they all look good, but even then, the only memorable part of the visuals of this episode is Fuerza, who's gotta be the worst CGI creature or design this show has ever had. After season 8 improved on season 7 by quite a bit, and the first episode of season 9 was, well, it wasn't good, but it wasn't awful either, I was still hopeful The Flash would end on a high note in its final season, basically until this episode aired. Hear No Evil continues what the previous episode left off, revealing probably the single worst character decision the show has ever made, as it's revealed that Caitlin's body has been taken over by a third personality in the very last season, which is not only already really stupid, but it only gets worse from there. The episode follows this disturbing story of Team Flash voting on whether or not to bring Caitlin or Frost back, which is already messed up, but then the fact that each person has an equal vote, including a known murderer, but other people who are closer to Caitlin, like her mother, or maybe Cisco, do not have a vote is doubly messed up. Then adding the fact that Keon basically decides to hijack Caitlin's body is triple messed up, and finally, the fact that nobody seems to care at all that Caitlin died, as they go dancing at a club at the end of the episode. It's ridiculous. This is the most messed up and out of character these characters or this world has ever been. What's more, Pied Piper is overly annoying in this episode, and the story features awful fight scenes, awful writing, and dialogue. Even if there are definitely some shots that look good, it's the one and only redeeming quality of the episode. The cinematography isn't always bad. Flash does look nice in some shots, but everything else showcases some of the stupidest and some of the worst stories and character decisions specifically the show has ever created. The finale of Season 7, which is also the finale of the Godspeed arc, is one of the most disappointingly awful episodes of the show, as the general concept of the episode being a team of speedsters fighting an army of Godspeeds, that sounds great, but the execution is so bad, the concept no longer matters, alongside some super goofy writing and god-awful character interactions and an awful main villain. The episode also features some of the most memorably terrible fight scenes in the show's history, as each speedster mostly forgets they are a speedster and instead becomes a Green Lantern, as everyone's just standing around throwing Speed Force constructs at each other, while they also do these stupid ass Power Rangers poses as the Godspeeds are just slowly walking towards them, slower even than a regular person, let alone an army of speedsters. Bringing Reverse Flash back to fight Godspeed makes no sense. The final fight using lightsabers is beyond ridiculous and just completely misunderstands what makes speedsters cool. Bart Allen singing at the end of the episode is so cringy. Literally the only redeeming quality of the episode besides Flash's suit is the scene where Flash destroys Reverse Flash, but everything leading into the scene makes no sense, neither does just letting him go, and Tom Cavanaugh doesn't exactly give his best performance. This episode is a grand showcase of some of the times that Eric Wallace has a good idea, but is utterly incapable of executing that idea well. The Force's storyline itself is god-awful due to Season 7's cringy dialogue, fight scenes, and cinematography, alongside the mistake that is the general concept of personifying the Forces and treating them like Barry and Iris' children, plus all of their power somehow looks stupid, all of which already mentioned earlier in the video. However, it comes to a head after a few episodes of build-up in the finale, as the show's single worst ever villain, the Speed Force, is put into some awful fight scenes and super uninteresting conflicts, complete with super over-the-top dialogue and acting, making for a generally awful main villain. As if the episode wasn't bad enough already, what's even worse than the main storyline is Frost's side storyline in interactions with Chillblaine, who, especially at that point, was one of the most ridiculous villains the show has ever had, whose karate fight scenes with Frost make no sense, and whose interactions with Frost are even more stupid. As per usual, the only redeeming quality in Season 7 is Flash's costume, and I guess also Grant Gustin's acting, because he's always good in every season. While admittedly looking mostly visually pleasing and focusing on both Barry and Iris while also featuring the Flash, Love is a Battlefield is probably where the show started to go truly downhill, as Season 6 reached a new low that the first 5 seasons never reached. This episode is so insanely goofy and cheesy, the villains are awful, and their rivalry and then romantic story is super weird. Then, adding in a side storyline that focuses on Frost as their feelings during Valentine's Day are on full display, Love is a Battlefield is a ridiculous waste of an episode, and is probably where the show passed the point of no return. It was after this episode, and especially in Season 7, and then especially in Season 9, where the show was just never the same. At one point, the lowest rated episode of the series before Season 9 came out and dethroned it twice, Rayo de Luz showcases all of the worst that the show can offer. Barry barely appears, Iris doesn't appear at all, while the episode actually focuses on Allegra in a storyline that clearly no one cares about, as she evolves her powers and something happens with her cousin. Honestly, I do not recall what the personal conflicts of this episode was. It's that forgettable. Allegra's story also features Sue Dearborn, which is again weird. When Ralph isn't on the show anymore, it feels wrong to have Sue. A side storyline focusing on Joe investigating Kramer for, again, I cannot remember for the life of me. Everything about this era of the show, and especially these interludes, is so ridiculously forgettable because of these characters and storylines that nobody cares about being given spotlight, coupled with awful writing, and with this episode not even featuring Barry all that much, it's gotta be the worst and easily the most forgettable episode of the season. However, there are 3 episodes in Season 9 that are all worse in my opinion. The third part to A New World, which is also the second to last episode of the show ever, doesn't even focus on the Flash. In this embarrassingly lazy attempt at a 2049 setting, no one looks older, no one has developed in 26 years. It feels like the people behind the show don't realize how far from now 2049 is, or at least if they do, they only really made one character develop, and that's Nora Allen, who developed from a fetus into a grown adult. I mean, the show itself is only 9 years, and an insane amount occurred during this time. You're gonna tell me in 26 years years, Cecile still hasn't chosen a name or gotten a superhero costume. If Cecile is 75 years old, this is embarrassing and depressing and kind of delegitimizes the Arrowverse as a proper adaptation of the DC universe. But then Cecile getting this ugly costume and becoming Virtue as a 75-year-old woman in 2049 after a pep talk from Chester where she realizes it doesn't matter that she never sees her family because she loves them is so ridiculous. I don't understand how it's real. Like I said in a previous review, I struggle to even accept its canonicity. Barry also doesn't appear for half of the episode and then remains a side character in the second half to Cecile in the second to last episode of his own show, which is beyond embarrassing. The plot with Eddie and Nora was awful, writing and bad acting. It takes far too long to develop Eddie. The only saving grace of this episode is Grant's acting and one decent fight scene between Flash and XS, but that's not nearly enough to keep an otherwise god-awful episode from being god-awful, because it is. In another one of the last ever episodes of the show, Barry is sidelined and does not appear as the Flash for the second episode in a row, and instead we focus on Iris, which is fine, but also on Dreamer, one of the least interesting characters from Supergirl, who not only did not have any unresolved plot lines as far as I could tell, but also has no connection to any character on the Flash, and the storyline ends up being incredibly boring. However, being boring is the least of this episode's problems. What is genuinely trash about this episode is the side storyline with Chillblaine and Keon, starting off really strong by just focusing on them in general, but also Chillblaine having a sex dream about Keon. The story somehow gets worse from there as Chillblaine and Keon go to a bar on a date. Again, these are characters I simply cannot care less about, but what truly sold this episode as one of the show's worst is the single worst scene in the show's history, in the scene in the bar where people are reacting to Keon and Chillblaine's argument. As I mentioned in my review of the episode, this is absolutely mind-boggling how this was created, how this went from someone's mind to the page to the screen. It's ridiculous. It's the stupidest scene in the entirety of the show, and this is one of the worst episodes the show has ever had. Coming right before the previous episode on this list, The Good, the Bad, and the Lucky is basically as bad as this show can get. Barry and Iris must have noticed how bad the episode was going to be because they leave in the first scene and come back in the last one, and instead we focus on Cecile going through a Spider-Man 2 style existential crisis affecting her terrible and awful powers, while she also struggles with the immoral decision she made regarding her family, as she should by the way, until she is gaslit by Allegra into thinking it's all okay. This story features the show's worst character going through this stupid storyline with terrible writing, stupid looking fight scenes, if you could even call them that. The cinematography is so bad, and even the acting is horrendous. Then there's a side storyline focusing on the other worst characters in the show, and admittedly it's one of Keon's best ever stories, and by that I mean there's one nice looking shot and everything else is completely forgettable, unimportant, and poorly written, as this character who should have never existed discovers her powers as a former murderer falls in love with this naive childlike third personality of a character whose dead second personality he was in love with, and it was currently hijacking the first personality who's been around since the very beginning but everyone thinks is dead, but no one cares that she's dead. What the hell am I even talking about at this point? Attempting to explain this to someone who's only watched the early seasons sounds impossible. It's so ridiculous. Genuinely, there is a reason why The Good, the Bad, and the Lucky is by far the lowest rated episode of the show ever, surpassing the former lowest rated episode by a full point. It has a 3.8 out of 10, as it's the worst The Flash has to offer, as The Flash doesn't appear, the worst characters are focused on, the writing, the plot, the action, the cinematography, and the general concepts of the episode are horrendous, all packaged into one of the final ever episodes of the show ever, being a Flashless filler episode. This is embarrassing.